All right, kicking off this episode, we have prison profits and cultural programming. So let me ask you something. What happens when incarceration becomes a business? Not just a public service, not a justice system, but an actual business, a publicly traded business. Companies like Core Civic, formerly CCA, and the Geo Group operate private prisons in the U.S. These are real corporations. They file real SEC reports. They have shareholders. They answer to quarterly earning calls. Now think about that. The business of incarcerating people. Just think about that. If your revenue depends on filled beds, then what exactly is your growth strategy? Well, here's a timeline that nobody wants to talk about. In the late 1980s and early 90s, America was at the height of the war on drugs. Mandatory minimum sentencing expanded. Then in 1994, we got the crime bill, which accelerated incarceration rates even further. The prison population exploded. From 1980 to around 2000, the U.S. incarceration rate roughly quadrupled 4 times. That's documented data. At the same time, private prison corporations expanded rapidly. States signed contracts. Some of those contracts historically included fill guarantees, meaning facilities were expected to maintain certain capacity levels, 90% or more. Let that sink in. 90% full capacity. We created a system where incarceration wasn't just policy, it was revenue. Now let's shift to the culture side of this. In the early 90s, hip-hop exploded into the mainstream. And let's be clear, hip-hop did not start as a hyper-violent commercial branding. There were conscious voices, political voices, community-driven voices. Some of my favorite artists like De La Soul, Tribe Called Quest, KRS-One, and Public Enemy. But what dominated the corporate airwaves? Gangster rap, violence, drug dealing narratives, prison imagery, street warfare aesthetics. Artists create from lived experience. Their art is a reflection of their environment. Labels do not invent poverty, nor do they invent crime. But labels absolutely choose what to market. They choose what gets distribution budgets. They choose what gets radio play. They choose what gets pushed globally. They choose what MTV and BET play. And you know what sells? Controversy sells. Violence sells. Shock sells. Rebellion sells. So here's the dots that we want to connect, right? If violence sells records and incarceration generates revenue and corporations operate on profit incentives, are we looking at a coincidence or an alignment? Just think about that. Is that a coincidence or was it aligned like that? The fact is that corporate systems reward what makes money. They're a business. During that same era that prison stocks were rising, violent commercial rap became the dominant mainstream export of urban culture. So listen, if you were a media executive studying profit margins, what would you push for? What would you push harder for? The artist talking about ownership and reform, or the one selling conflict and chaos? Follow the ownership, follow the money. Now let's go one layer deeper. Major record labels are subsidiaries of massive media conglomerates. And those conglomerates are largely owned by institutional investment firms like BlackRock and Vanguard, firms that hold significant stakes across multiple industries, such as media, defense contractors, private prisons, pharmaceutical companies, and tech platforms. Ownership overlaps. And when ownership overlaps, incentives overlaps. That's structural power, not a conspiracy theory. So when you think of the psychological loop, now you have to think about the social loop. Media amplifies violent imagery. Culture absorbs and reflects it. Crime policies tightens. Incarceration rises. Private prisons profit. Politicians campaign on law and order, and the cycle repeats. No secret memo required, just aligned incentives. That's all. America monetizes everything. healthcare, war, education, debt, and incarceration. So when incarceration is monetized and culture shapes behavior and media shapes behavior, you have to ask, is culture purely organic? Or is it manufactured? Or is it optimized? Not controlled in a cartoon villain way, optimized in a profit maximization way that's more subtle and honestly more powerful. So the dangerous question would be this: why did corporate America heavily promote the most destructive stereotypes globally? Why was that the export? Why did uplifting, ownership focused, community building messages rarely receive the same machine backing? Private prisons profit from filled beds. Some contracts historically have included fill clauses. I mentioned the 90% fill clause earlier. Corporate labels control distribution pipelines. Violent content dominated commercial promotion in the 1990s. Institutional investors hold cross-industry ownership stakes. So what does that mean? It's a lot of words, right? What does that mean? So if prison is a business and violence sells and capital owns pieces of both worlds, maybe the real issue isn't conspiracy. Maybe it's capitalism without moral guardrails. Maybe it's what happens when shareholder value becomes the highest low. And maybe, just maybe, we should stop arguing about artists and start asking, who benefits from this?